Welcome to the Jali Podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Barrett. This podcast is for those who are interested in the conversation around diversity, inclusion, and equity. Each week, I'll be interviewing a guest who has something special to share or is actively part of building solutions in this space. Let's get started. Dr. Scott Edington is the CEO and co-founder for Deep Labs. His career spans over 2 decades of creating next-generation technology capabilities in the payments, defense, and intelligence sectors. Prior to co-founding Deep Labs, Dr. Edington served as the global head of research and development for Visa Incorporated. Edington played a critical role in both the formation and execution of Visa's innovation and technology strategies and served as a member of Visa's Architectural Leadership Board. Prior to joining Visa, Edington was a technology executive at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he ran the firm's technology injection emerging technologies practice. In this capacity, he was responsible for all of Booz Allen's technology injection, R&D, strategic prototyping, and knowledge management and information sharing efforts. Edington also directed the firm's external technology relationships with academia, national labs, the vendor community, and various technology incubators. He holds a degree from the University of Virginia, Johns Hopkins University, and industry certifications in the areas of security, strategy, and network computing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Edington. Dr. Edington, thank you so much for joining me for this wonderful conversation. I am ecstatic to talk to you about all of the things that you have accomplished with respect to now you being the CEO and co-founder of Deep Labs. And maybe we could just start there and you can talk about, what is Deep Labs?
Sure. Well, number one, thanks for taking the time to spend with me this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity. So Deep Labs, in a sort of 30-second overview, million-foot view, it's a company that's pretty much focused entirely on context-aware artificial intelligence capabilities. And so what that means for the non-geek out there effectively is, think of a world where computer systems really fully appreciate what persona you might be exhibiting at any given moment in time. So the easy example I always use is Scott Edington sitting in Oakland, California, pre-pandemic is a little different than Scott Edington having sheltered in place for 2.5 to 3 months in Oakland, California. Yes, from an identity perspective, it's still Scott, but obviously the context and everything around all of us has shifted. And because of that, having systems that are intelligent enough to understand that, it's still Scott, but the personas that Scott will now exhibit will be dramatically different or would have shifted based on context, based on surroundings, based on, everything that's happening in 2020.
Yeah, that's interesting that you call them personas because as in the world of diversity and inclusion, and of course, I've worked in the area of identity, it's all about your identity. And it's almost like we have multiple identities all over the place, whether you're at work or at home or, what your shopping looks like or any of that kind of stuff. So those personas, I'm assuming, can really engage a person in different ways depending on what they're trying to do.
No, I think you nailed it, Melissa. Obviously, given your background, you fully appreciate all the interesting things that have happened in the industry in the last 10, 20, now 30 years of our respective careers. And the reality is that, circa 2005, 2010, simply using sort of static attributes like mom's maiden name or social security number, that was fine, frankly. And that's how most of the systems sort of keyed off of understanding, is it really Scott or is it not, right? But as we all know, unfortunately, due to some well-known data breaches and other things that have occurred now in the world, those static signals are frankly very much antiquated or, in my vernacular, decayed. And they've decayed because everyone has access to them now. I mean, you can Google where I went to high school, you can Google where I was born, it's freely available and most times pretty accurate. And if the things you can't Google, you can certainly find on the dark web for next to nothing. And so because of that, as we both know as practitioners, there were a number of point solution providers that came up specifically focused around things like address verification or device signals and device intelligence, which again, were absolutely fantastic as a sort of a way to sort of patch the holes. But unfortunately, like anything else, the advanced persistent threats that exist out there, whether it be from nation state actors, whether it be from folks who are individuals trying to do nefarious things, these signals have also decayed. And so what we've really been focused on is figuring out a mechanism and capabilities now we have to effectively create a full context-rich understanding of about an actor. And an actor for us, by the way, could be an organization, it could be a consumer, it could be a human being, it could be a bot. But the idea is effectively we want to be able to understand at multi-layers which signals should be used to identify what context that actor happens to be in, and then understand exactly what persona we'd expect that actor to exhibit at this moment in time versus what the reality is, and then effectively figure out a mechanism to see whether or not is that really who we expect Scott Edington's persona to be right now versus, we've actually seen this persona before, and last time we saw it was associated with a bad act. I know they presented all the correct credentials, but decline. Or, it's a little different than we might expect from Scott at this moment, but he's in Washington, D.C. today as opposed to Oakland, California. Therefore, let's not introduce friction to this consumer experience. Let's go ahead and approve that transaction. And so it does work both ways, either from a propensity standpoint or an authorization standpoint, all the way to the opposite spectrum, which is advanced risk capabilities.
Yeah, we have truly geeked out right now. I know I have my mom sitting here going, what are they talking about? No. But so tell me a little bit about how you got here, because, the stuff that you're talking about when you start talking about artificial intelligence and all of the things that occur in the background to try and detect bad actors, there's a lot of folks, and I know even from a representation standpoint, there are not a lot of people of color in the industry that you're in. So how did you start out and how did you actually get to where you are today?
Yeah, not to sound too cheesy about it, but I think it really starts at home. And so I was blessed to have, and still do, two parents who are educators. And prior to that, their parents, both sets literally were also teachers. And so education was always very, very important for us in the household. Now, if you ask my parents about that and whether or not I valued that as a grade school kid or a high school kid, I get a different response. But it was always certainly very important in our household. And my older brother, Charles, electrical engineer, also went to the University of Virginia undergrad, and ultimately ended up going to Booz Allen and working in the intelligence community, was also very much focused on sort of signals and noise. So I've always sort of played in that realm, or at least certainly been interested in sort of signals and what does that really mean, even in layman's terms or non-geek terms. And sort of that understanding of how signals can be harnessed is always sort of important to me and interesting to me. And so even as I went, as an undergrad at the University of Virginia, my focus was always trying to understand why people do what they do, and when they do it. And so if you were to look at sort of my undergrad, curriculum, for lack of a better term, it's a combination of economics, computer science, philosophy, government, and even religious studies. And the idea was, what are the attitudinal, what are the psychographic, what are the sort of economic things or incentives that get people to do or influence what people do and why. And so, as I was leaving undergrad, down at the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville, most of the firms that were there were hiring for either New York or Washington, D.C. And most of the offers I received were actually for Washington, D.C. And as you might imagine, being around the Beltway, a lot of those folks were really focused on sort of the public sector work. And specifically, my focus was in defense and the intel community. And so as you might imagine, signals and noise are very, very important. And, not to totally date myself, but when I was coming out of school, that was, circa late 90s, early 2000s. And there were obviously some things happening around the world that were, that necessitated having folks who really understood, how to parse signals, how to use that for, to create a competitive advantage, whether it be on the commercial side or for our war fighters and the intel community as well.
Interesting. Wow. So you just jumped right into defense. And then you ended up at Booz Allen from there, or?
No, so yeah. So
that was part of what Booz Allen did.
Exactly right. So, our focus there at the time was around primarily the defense and intel community. And so, frankly, I don't want to say I lucked into it, but I kind of lucked into the role that I had, which was, it wasn't dedicated to a single customer or single client. It was actually across the whole spectrum. So I had the opportunity to you can't make the stuff up, literally meet, folks like the Secretary of Defense and whether it be the people literally on the ground about to go to Iraq or later on Afghanistan, all the way to the folks who happen to operate in some of the other circles that you'd expect in the intel community. And a kid, 22-year-old kid, who was born in Greensboro, grew up in the Philadelphia area, you're not going to expect to see things like that, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
That had to be kind of a shift for sure. I mean, and I'm assuming then you had some mentors, sponsors, people that kind of helped you, because I can't imagine going from school to, hey, by the way, here's the Secretary of Defense and we've got folks going to Iraq. What was that like?
It's one of those things where, I think sometimes youth is actually, the old adage is sort of wasted on the young. Like at the time I was like, well, yeah, this is normal, right? Like this, yeah, of course you meet with a 2-star general and you brief them on the cool stuff you're doing. Like that's what everyone does, right? And you look back 20 plus years later and you're like, no, that's not what happened, Scott. Come on, man.
Right.
And, so to answer your direct question, I was very fortunate, early on, my first executive boss at Booz Allen, actually, again, looking back, how this happened, was, very instrumental in my career. He was a former fighter pilot, again, F-4, he flew F-4 Phantoms in the Vietnam War, literally ran R&D for McDonnell Douglas, back when that company happened to exist. And so you hear these things, you're like, oh, like Top Gun, in my head, I'm like, oh, this is like Top Gun the movie, right? It's like, oh, actually, no, literally it's like that. And, talking about landing aircrafts on aircraft carriers out in the Indian Ocean, this crazy stuff like that. And I share that story only to say is that, that particular gentleman took, looking back, a fair amount of time with me and probably was far more patient than he probably should have been with me. And I think that's important because, number one, it taught me how to be a true professional. But I think number two, also the notion of learning to pay it forward. All right. I vividly remember a conversation, and again, I'm telling myself a little bit, vividly remember a conversation I had when I was, I think, 22 or 23. I think that was about a year and a half in my career at Booz. And apparently, I thought I was doing a great job. Well, he let me know a little different in the sense that, he sat me down and I remember it was yesterday. He sat me down and he said, Scott, I have this problem. And I'm hoping you can help me out with it. And I was like, yeah, of course, because I know everything, right? Of course I can help you out. And he says, I have this this really bright kid that I think has a lot of potential, but he's just not getting it. And I was like, well, I'm happy to mentor him. I'm happy to. He's like, Scott, come on, man, it's you. Wake up, it's you. Here's what you're not doing. Here's what you need to do. Here's the expected outcomes. Blah 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 blah. And at the time I was not gonna lie, I was a little bit hurt, a little bit taken aback, but I was just like, the fact that he took that much time, the senior executive at this, Fortune 500 company, one of the best consulting firms literally in the world, that must mean something. That must mean that there is something to be had here in terms of what he believes I can do, and thus I should be able to do it. And so I've always sort of really, went out of my way to find, sort of want to say diamonds in the rough, but diamonds in the rough where it's like, what, sometimes people just need a truthful conversation, a real truthful conversation. And it's not that there's lack of intent or any malice. Sometimes when people aren't performing, it's because sometimes they just need a chance. Sometimes they need some straight talk. In other cases, you just need to be very clear in terms of what the expectations are, which is not always given, frankly, not always given to us. And so, I 20 plus years later, I still, I vividly remember that, like it was yesterday, like I mentioned before, but I also go out on a way to sort of talk with some of the young folks, especially people of color, about that story, because frankly, he didn't have to do that. He chose to do that. And, looking back, it was a 5-minute investment of his time, but it's been, now a 20 plus year career that has definitely benefited from.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I mean, those people, you think back and, they had a pivotal impact on your career, I'm sure, for you to be able to recall it like it was yesterday. But I think, those are the things that continue to push you to levels of excellence. My father used to always tell me, he used to always compare me and the president to, what did you do today? Because you're slacking, right? So, you always want to have high standards for what you're doing. So flipping back to, kind of the work that you're doing in artificial intelligence and signals, one of the things that I hear a lot about is just in terms of people of color. And, I spend a lot of time, obviously, on financial education. And so there is this whole segment about financial inclusion. And essentially, there are many people, specifically of color, who are not part of the financial system. But I think all economies think that they should be working or at least have a strategic plan to address financial inclusion. So can you talk a little bit about how artificial intelligence and where we're going impacts people that are not, maybe they don't have a bank account or they aren't, maybe they're using a check cashing or, doing some alternative financing. How does that impact some of the stuff that you're doing with artificial intelligence and all of those discussions we're having on privacy and other things?
Well, number one, thanks for the question. It's a topic that I'm, as you know, very passionate about, specifically the underbanked populations, whether it be here in the U.S. or certainly globally. The numbers are very clear that they disproportionately affect people of color. So, I would say, first and foremost, I think the key thing is understanding, again, going back to my college days, what are the influences as to why that's happening? So that could be both macro and micro. I think there are some obviously systematic reasons for some of the underbanked reasons, but I also think from a techie perspective for a second, if you sort of take a step back and look at how typical systems, bank systems or financial services systems work in terms of how they onboard new customers or clients, how they make, credit underwriting decisions, how they verify things like income or verify addresses. These are all sort of things that, frankly, you and I sort of take for granted, given where we are. But these are real things that are hurdles and introduce friction, even for something simply as I want to start a bank account for my 8-year-old, or I want to start a college fund, or I just want to have a checking account so I can write checks, or God forbid write checks now, but have sort of participate in the digital economy. And so, what I would say, going back to my earlier statement around signals and noise, the ability to not always focus in on sort of the antiquated signals of yesteryear, mom's maiden name, what high school did you go to, some of the old sort of static signals, but more focus on the near or sort of the recent signals that now exist based off of where we are and normally where we would be in 2020 and hopefully now in 2021. And I stress that only because whether we, again, talk about digital onboarding remotely, because now I guess everyone really doesn't want to go into a branch, but how do you actually identify that is in fact Scott without having a social security card? Again, I'm dating myself, social security card or a passport. How do you do that remotely? How do you do that securely? How do you do that in a frictionless environment that's not overly invasive, number one, but still has a confidence level that's high enough that actually meets the guidelines necessary for a risk-based system? And so, a long answer to your very short question, the reality is that for the underbanked populations, keying off of things that are again, static signals of yesteryear is actually a method of disenfranchisement. It is. And so if we're able to use the modern signals, if we're able to use the context that we talked before around personas, then in fact you can start providing banking services and banking capabilities to folks who ordinarily wouldn't necessarily have a generic checking account. So if you're talking about, let's say, the prepaid market as an example, because as we both know, that's something the underbanked population does leverage. How do you actually still enable them to be onboarded and still meet the demands of like the Patriot Act, as you know? That sometimes is difficult for some people from a hurdle perspective, right? So again, is it simply keying off of the static signals, or can you actually start replacing some of those static signals with dynamic signals that we now enjoy? And the answer overwhelmingly is yes.
Let's pause for a moment. We'll be right back. Well, and it's interesting because it seems like the more signals we get, the more models are built that provide, things like credit scoring and fraud scoring capabilities. And if the underbanked population has a lack of information in those models, then it can create other challenges for whatever the objective is, which, to your point, hopefully is less systemic in terms of, kind of hurdles around systemic racism and stuff like that in the past, because at least it's using information in an objective manner. But if the data is not there, then I guess you have other issues. So how do you account for things like signals that aren't really there?
Mm-hmm. No. So I 100% agree with you. And I would answer it in two parts. I think the first thing is, let's just fully recognize how the old systems work, right? And what they over-index for, which is, given your background, firsthand, they're over-indexed for things that tend to represent certain populations, not others, right? So if you look at it from a pure data science and modeling perspective, what does the sample look like, right? And figuring out what should the sample be in 2020 versus maybe what it was in 1985 or 1990, when a lot of these systems were first sort of theorized, right? And so if you sort of eliminate the lack of proper sampling and you actually fix that, that's step one. Step two is, if you now have a proper sample or a fully representative sample, then you can start looking at other methods and other attributes and characteristics that could represent the gap that you just mentioning, right? So again, as opposed to keying off of where you went to high school, the fact that you've had a job for the last two years at the same place. Frankly, I'd rather know that
than where you went to high school.
Yeah, where I went to high school, back in the early 90s, right? So, and I sort of say it somewhat flippantly, but it's actually true. Again, if you really just think about the context surrounding each individual, human beings are remarkably great at picking up on things, right? When someone's a little bit off that day, right? Or something, your gut says something's not quite right. Up until now, those models, they didn't really take into account instinct or gut. They would just hard, fast numbers. This is what we've always done. It's decline. As opposed to, wait a minute, this guy's had a job for the last 2 years, same place, same income level. That company's doing well. I can tell you that company's doing well because, 1,000 other factors that we have access to. You know what? He's actually not a credit risk, right? Like that's actually someone we want to get behind, as opposed to decline because we can't figure out where we went to high school. Who cares?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because so where do you think we're going now, since you're all into the artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency and all of that? What does life look like 10 years from now?
Well, I'm glad you said 10 years as opposed to next year.
It's anybody's guess, 2021, right?
I would be happy to make it to 2021, right? No, in all seriousness, I think from a financial services perspective, I think it really does come down to just hyper-personalization. But not in like in a creepy way where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, no, this is too sci-fi-ish, like 1980s sci-fi movie-ish. I don't want that, right? But what customers do want, and to be fair, it's also a little bit generational, right? So the kids sound old now. The kids that are coming up right now, they have a certain expectation about what an experience looks like versus someone, let's say my parents' age, who are like, wait, no, I want to actually get to type in my name. I don't want them to know it was me that just walked in the door, right? And it's slightly generational, but I would say to answer your direct question, 10 years from now, it really is all about hyper-personalization. It is about understanding not only that it's Scott, but it's Scott on a Friday afternoon, somewhat dressed down. And right now I can tell you, I can extrapolate that Scott's sort of quasi-business Scott, but he's sort of sliding into the weekend. So his persona will have shifted. The things that Scott will expect to have as he walks into a restaurant or walks into a grocery store will be dramatically different than if he was Tuesday afternoon, full suit in New York City, walking down the street. Yeah, it's still Scott, but hey, I'm going to influence Scott to maybe purchase this item. Or, you know what, don't bother Scott at all, because very clearly he has a serious look on his face, carrying his briefcase, and he's headed to a customer meeting. And so, again, for me, it is about total hyper-personalization. It's about understanding exactly what persona that actor is exhibiting at that moment in time, what persona we expect that person to exhibit in a window of time, And then ultimately, how do you best create an environment that is friction free and also very secure, that again creates that hyper personalized experience such that that consumer wants to use your product, or that consumer wants to be part of your community. I mean, it's not to totally geek out on you, but like that's what's coming, and frankly, that's what's already here.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting because I'm maybe dating myself now, but I still remember the Jetsons when I was growing up. And that's what it feels like. We're kind of moving into the Jetsons, which, is pretty old when you think about what they were envisioning way back then. So very interesting stuff.
Well, I'd say what's funny though about because I used to watch the Jetsons and Flintstones and all that stuff too, is that if you really sort of dissect those shows, like a lot of that stuff's already happened.
Yeah.
Right? So whether it be the scooters that try to knock me over in the middle of Oakland half the time, or down in here in DC, that's real, right? Whether it be all the sensor technology that enables things like the Segway devices to work, or whether it be even our online experiences where, lo and behold, I'm talking to you via video camera and real time feed, and it's almost like you're in the same room with me. That was all. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know when I was growing up in the late 70s and the 80s, that was all sci-fi stuff. Like that wasn't going to happen, and that's here now. And so the ability to even all the way down to using a mobile device and be able to unlock it with your face, or your fingerprints, or to be able to transact, i.e., send some form of currency halfway around the world, and as you know, Visa, less than a second. Like that's amazing. And that's already here right now.
Yeah. I love it. So I'm going to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent, because I know now that you lead a company, Deep Labs, there has to be lots of discussion on representation and diversity and and I know you have somebody that's dedicated to, I think they call it people and culture, if I remember her title properly. And, I have been at places where people say, I don't want to talk about company culture. We don't have a corporate culture. What does that mean? Now we have this whole segment of people that are focused on diversity and inclusion. And I think probably every practitioner would agree that ideally those jobs should go away at some point, because really we should have diversity and inclusion, belonging, equity, all embedded into all of the company activities. So are there things, especially in your business, I imagine, with representation being challenging for STEM students, like what are some things that you guys are thinking about in terms of, accessing talent in those areas?
Yeah, great question. As you know me well, that's a topic I'm quite passionate about and fully believe in. So I would say, my mindset, to be fair, is also very much given the fact that both my parents were children of the '60s, growing up in the South, and again, my grandparents, both sides were educators. So again, education is very important. It's the building blocks of how you sort of get ahead, so to speak, right, to actually achieve the quote unquote American dream. And so with that as a backdrop, my father worked at HBCUs for most of his career. And so again, understanding how HBCUs work, understanding how the network effect associated with that, something that we, whether it be when I was at Booz or at Visa, and certainly now we do tap into from a pipeline perspective. The good news is there's plenty of folks out there who are, super motivated, highly intelligent, and they just want an opportunity, right? The difficult part is figuring out how to map those folks who have all those attributes that you want into roles that, and frankly also locations where there are communities of people of color, right? And so for us at Deep Labs, the cool thing, I was going to plug my company for a second, sorry I have to do it, is that we have locations, whether it be in the Bay Area or in places like New York and Washington, D.C., which, as you know, have large communities of people of color. And so we are actively seeking folks who want to join a company that is very much forward-looking, forward-thinking, but also very much mindful of very clear core values around things like accountability, which is important, but collaboration and integrity, and having a high degree of teamwork. And I stress that because at the end of the day, from a pipeline perspective, especially within the STEM perspective, most folks who come up with those programs, they've had to abide by those core values just to make it, right? You have to be accountable not only to yourself, but to other classmates. You have to have integrity of your work. Obviously, you're not going to get your diploma if you're not being honest. You have to be able to show teamwork and collaboration, because oftentimes you're dealing with group projects and everything else, right? And so for us, again, really having a dedicated function within our company focused on diversity and inclusion and people and culture is, we believe, as a fundamental enabler to the success of our business. And I would say, having spoken with other people of color that either have co-founded or founded other companies or senior executives at Fortune 100 companies, that is something that I believe is sort of universally shared at this point. I will say that, unfortunately for us, due much like everyone else in the pandemic, it has hurt a little bit our ability to recruit, if for no other reason, just getting in front of people. But I would say that for those who are listening that are actually seeking positions, there are people like me who are actually looking for people like you.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think, because even during the pandemic, I think people thought that, there's no jobs out there. And I kept trying to send them out because, every other day somebody would say they're hiring, even through the pandemic. So I think it's interesting to see how growth occurs, because clearly there's some contraction going on, but then in other areas there is still lots of growth happening, and I know we've seen lots of, digitization growth over the last, several months. So it'll be interesting to see how things develop. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in 10 years, flying a self-driving car somewhere or maybe back in defense somewhere. Who knows?
Who knows?
Well, thank you so much for being with me today. And it's always a pleasure catching up with you, Dr. Edington. And I know you do a lot of teaching. I know that's near and dear to your heart as well. So I appreciate you bringing up historically Black colleges and universities, because a lot of the HBCUs don't get the credibility, the visibility that they really deserve. So kudos to your parents and your grandparents for putting so much into you that you can continue to feed it into other generations.
No, I appreciate that. And I will definitely pass it along to them. They'll be pleased to hear that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here, Scott. And I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Melissa. Take care.
Thanks for joining me on the Jali Podcast. Please subscribe so you won't miss an episode. See you next week.